Hi everyone, your old pal Will Sloan here. On this special episode, I'm going to be talking to the editors of a new book about Roberta Findlay. If that name sounds familiar, you've probably already gone down the rabbit hole. But if not, Roberta Findlay is one of the most prolific American female filmmakers of the 20th century, and one who oversaw every aspect of her films as a director, writer, cinematographer, producer, and entrepreneur. But Findlay has been a difficult figure to canonize for a few reasons. She worked exclusively in exploitation films, first in soft and hardcore pornography, and later direct-to-video horror. Some of these films are good, others less so, but all were conceived primarily to make money, and it can be difficult to trace Findlay's authorial voice. There's also the fact that Findlay herself resists canonization. In interviews, she'll say that she hates her films, that the people who watch them are stupid. She rejects being labeled a pioneer, and she often strikes an anti-feminist posture, saying that she dislikes women and won't hire them. Here's an excerpt of her interview on the Essential podcast, The Rialto Report.
You know, some would make a case for you being a pioneer in film.
Well, I'm sure you can, but I don't know what it is that I discovered, learned, or did that was new, or something that had never been done before. And what a field to be a pioneer in.
You have no regrets, though, about what you've done, do you?
Well, yeah, I do. So, big deal. I don't know why I couldn't get out, but I never got out. I wish I'd done something worthwhile.
What would you have done?
I would have been a doctor. It's true.
Born in New York City in 1943, Roberta Hershkowitz was trained through her childhood to be a classical pianist, but instead of pursuing a music career, she met a fellow student at City College named Michael Findlay, who would become her husband. Throughout the 60s, the Findlays entered the underground film world, collaborating on many fondly remembered sexploitation movies, notably the legendary Flesh trilogy, The Touch of Her Flesh, The Curse of Her Flesh, and The Kiss of Her Flesh.
I wondered if you had enough guts to face me. I've been waiting for this for a long, long time.
And I've been waiting too, Steve. Waiting ever since the day I saw you and my wife, Claudia. Waiting to chop the ugly penis from your body.
In the early 70s, their horror films included Shriek of the Mutilated and a film inspired by the Manson murders that would eventually be released and become very controversial as Snuff.
Ladies and gentlemen, the bloodiest thing that ever happened in front of a camera. Snuff. Snuff, the film that could only be made in South America, where life is cheap.
Roberta served as a cinematographer, co-writer, and occasional actor on these films, and is often informally considered their co-director. But today she rejects any authorship, sometimes claiming that she was barely involved in her husband's films. This is plainly untrue, but her ambivalence no doubt stems from the fact that her marriage was troubled. Roberta has speculated that Michael's violent, sexually transgressive films were outlets for real anguish. The two were estranged at the time of his death in 1977, at age 39. By that time, Michael had developed a new, less expensive form of 3D photography that had been used in Asia. In fact, he's credited as a consultant on the early Jackie Chan film Magnificent Bodyguards. His death is still notorious. He was catching a helicopter to JFK Airport on the roof of the Pan Am building when the helicopter's landing gear failed, the aircraft tipped, and Michael was slashed to death by the blades. By then, Roberta had a new man in her life, the producer-distributor Alan Shackleton, who released Snuff. With Shackleton as her producing partner, Roberta Findlay in the 1970s became the first notable female filmmaker in the American hardcore porn industry. Her best films in this realm include Anyone But My Husband, Angel on Fire, and especially A Woman's Torment, a psychological thriller inspired by Roman Polanski's Repulsion. Even if you're not interested in 70s porn, I recommend A Woman's Torment.
Would you like to know how my cunt feels? It's on fire, Fanny. It wants to get rubbed. I want to get fucked. You want to be like that, Fanny? You're crazy. You let me out of here. In a minute. In a minute.
Findlay continued making adult films into the mid-1980s until the rise of video and the decline of theatrical exhibition chipped away at the profit margins for such films. By now, her partner in both art and life was Walter Sear, and with him as co-producer, she dipped into mainstream exploitation with a series of modestly budgeted horror films: Blood Sisters, The Oracle, Primeval, Lurkers, and my favorite, the riveting urban hellscape thriller Tenement. Findlay has been inactive as a director since her 1989 film Band, a comedy set in the world of punk music, which failed to attract a distributor. Today, she is the manager of Sear Sound, the recording studio in Manhattan founded by her late partner. Its clients have included David Bowie, Paul McCartney, Sting, Liza Minnelli, and dozens of others you've heard of. A poster for Blood Sisters reportedly hangs at the studio, which suggests that Roberta Findlay may be prouder of her filmic legacy than she lets on, and also that Sir Paul might even be aware of it. As Findlay has been busy at her day job, interest in her films has increased. Among cult movie fans, among cinephiles interested in the untold history of women in a male-dominated industry, and among academics fascinated by the complexities that her work embodies. For the rest of this episode, I'll be talking to co-editors of the first book on Findlay's work. ReFocus, the Films of Roberta Findlay, is part of a series of academic books focused on filmmakers just outside the canon. The book features essays about every facet of her career, as well as a revealing interview with the filmmaker. The book has just been released in paperback, and on Tuesday, December 3rd at 4 p.m., the authors will be hosting a virtual launch party, which Ms. Findlay herself has promised to attend.
Tenement is the place to be to get away from the jungles in the city street. Tenement is a place of shelter, but you still can't escape the helter-skelter. Tenement.
I also want the two of you to know that when this book was $100 last year, I bought it because I was so hungry for this book. I needed this book so bad that I paid the $100 for it. So call me a sucker if you will, but I did.
Wow, no, that's amazing. I mean, I guess exploitation is real, huh?
Yeah. Can I ask the two of you to just introduce yourselves?
I'm Peter Alilunas. I am an associate professor of cinema studies at the University of Oregon.
I'm Whit Strub. I'm an associate professor of history at Rutgers University, Newark.
First of all, I'm going to start with the kind of obvious question that one would ask about a book about Roberta Findlay. You know, she's not really an auteur. In all of her interviews, she talks about how film was a strictly commercial enterprise. And as to the thought that she's a pioneer, she's often striking a very anti-feminist posture in her interviews. So given all that, why Roberta Findlay?
You know, I'll just say a couple words about the origins of the book. Our very good friends, Finley Freibert and Alicia Cosma, did a book in the same series about Doris Wishman. And I know I speak for Whit when I say the films of Doris Wishman are, you know, a treasure. And that book was very exciting to me that it was going to happen because I feel like Doris Wishman is a very underappreciated filmmaker. And after that book was, I think it was in production, Alicia wrote to me and said, would you be interested in doing anything in this series? And I said, I definitely would, now that you've shown we can do, you know, these kind of filmmakers. But I said, I will really only do it on one condition, though, and that's if Whit does it with me. Because I had been looking for a project to do with Whit for quite a few years, and I thought this would be the one. And we kicked around a couple of ideas, and we settled on Roberta Findlay, and obviously I'm glad that we did. Now, the reasons for that, I'll let Whit speak about in a second, much more eloquently than me, because I think Whit really had the strong case to choose Roberta. But for me, it was the contradictions. The fact that Roberta Findlay does not want to acknowledge these elements in her own career that we felt were not only evident, but important to talk about. So that's the reasoning for me.
Yeah, and just dovetailing off of that, like Peter said, we've known one another for quite some time, good friends, mutual admirers, and so it seemed like a fun thing to do. And for folks who aren't familiar with this series, Edinburgh University Press has the series called ReFocus, the American Directors Series, and they're all edited scholarly volumes dedicated to a single filmmaker, and most of them are not exploitation filmmakers, right? I'm just looking at it in front of me. They tend to be underappreciated directors who haven't gotten the same kind of scholarly attention that, Howard Hawks, Hitchcock, and John Ford have. So like Barbara Koppel, Kelly Reichardt, Paul Schrader, John Hughes. But they showed that the door was open to exploitation adult cinema with the Wishman book. And so I think we bandied around, we thought about Joe Sarno, but we knew that Tim Lucas has a long in the making book coming on Sarno. And just on a personal level, I find Findlay's films more interesting and engaging. I like Sarno for what he is, but he's a little Ingmar Bergman of the Grindhouse, And so, yeah, I mean, I think, like Peter said, it was the rich set of contradictions that Findlay kind of thrusts upon you. And also, I think our fundamental argument was not necessarily about aesthetics anyway, so much as industrial craft and the role that she played in sort of forging these exploitation cinemas from the 60s grindhouse to the 70s adult world to the 80s video horror world. That I think for us was the exciting thing. It was just, here's this filmmaker who, you can take or leave her films as aesthetic objects, but she unquestionably shaped exploitation cinema as we know it, and just deserves some rigorous analysis for that.
The other thing I'll just add quickly is that if you spend any time at all studying this, little sector of film history, you will encounter over and over again these discourses of people saying, I'm a rebel, I'm an outlaw, I reject mainstream culture, and I want to be on the margins. But it's rare you find somebody who backs that up to the degree that Roberta does. Roberta just will basically reject everything. If you make any assertion or any claim, she'll just sort of by reflex reject that. And I'm just going to be honest and say that I actually really admire that. I like the rebellious spirit that is so intense that she's willing to, just push everything and everybody away to maintain whatever that sense of self is that she has. Her contradictions and ideological stuff aside for a second, I like that part of who she is.
There are a couple of different, very distinct phases of her career from the 60s to the 80s. For both of you, was there one that in particular was your gateway?
I mean, for me, I moved to Los Angeles for grad school in 2001, which kind of opened my video store world. I'd grown up in small town Minnesota and Alaska, where we actually had some pretty good video stores, but not the kind of thing you're going to find in Los Angeles. And that coincided with the heyday of Something Weird Video, moving on to DVD with the Image partnership. And so for me, it was really the late 60s Roughies and Flesh trilogy, Take Me Naked, that whole first wave of Something Weird Video that brought me into the Findlay verse, I guess.
Same for me. The Flesh trilogy and the mythology around Michael Findlay when I was younger was sort of so dark and unusual, strange. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, which is, the opposite side of the continent from this grimy New York City thing that when I was younger, I was completely fascinated by that. Like, what is this 42nd Street? So yeah, for me too, that was the gateway to Roberta Findlay for me too.
I know that trying to find her authorial presence can be a challenge, but do you see a continuity between the films with Michael Findlay and the films she was making in the mid-70s, the sort of Anyone But My Husband era?
I mean, definitely there's a shared misanthropy there, right? I mean, you get the sense that more than anything is probably what brought them together and that they bonded over, a sort of deep anti-humanism. I think Michael had his more fetishistic views of sexuality, whereas Roberta has a more hostile view of sex and sexuality in her films, but that overlaps and does coincide, right? I mean, for Michael, it's all kind of panting and huffing and puffing and moaning about sexual perversion, whereas for her, it's sort of, this is the harsh, ugly world of sex that I'm forced to depict by generic convention. But that does intersect. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there is that continuity of a sort of perverse anti-eroticism for her, which for him was eroticism.
Yeah, and it's interesting thinking about how that mutates a little bit later in her films. One of the things I loved most about this project as it was evolving was Whit did a tremendous job of tracing through her films in the 1970s this strain of, anti-erotic dialogue it's just beautiful in its own way, where you have these characters who say things like, just hurry up and get it over with, or variations on like, that's it? Like, that's all that, are we finished? Or like, I suppose if we have to, like, just this, world weary, like, it's just so completely anti-pleasurable. And to me, that's a thread directly back to the Flesh trilogy type of voiceovers, which they're so beautiful in their own way. I love them.
This isn't a question, it's just an observation. There are certain of the adult films in the 70s. Like, I know that pretty much from the outset, when she became a solo director, she was marketed as a female filmmaker. Like on Angel on Fire, which I think is the first one that's a solo film of hers. Like, the poster said the first erotic film by a female director or something like that. And that one and Anybody But My Husband can be interpreted, I hesitate to use the word feminist, but they're concerned with a woman's point of view. They're concerned with a woman's subjectivity and the ways women can be oppressed by patriarchal society. And then you get later on to a movie like Shauna, Every Man's Fantasy. And there's a sort of ping-ponging back and forth between movies that can be regarded as from a woman's point of view and other movies that are like some of the most grotesquely, maybe misogynistic is the wrong word given that they're from a female filmmaker, but they're very unpleasant and, I hate to use the word evil, but Shauna, Every Man's Fantasy, like, what else do you say about it? And I'm curious if that ping-ponging back and forth inspires any thoughts in you.
I'll just say that we knew going into this project we were going to have to contend with some of that stuff, especially Shauna. Like, you obviously don't leave that out of the history or the story. It's a crucial piece of the story. And one of the, sadder parts of the project for me was just seeing how Roberta continues to double or triple down on the attitudes about that film in particular. She's unabashedly unapologetic about the sort of cynical, frankly, greed of making the film and standing by it to this day. And there's a brilliant chapter in the collection by one of our authors about that story. And
I'll just briefly interrupt to note that Kayla Janice wrote the essay, and it's very good. And Shauna, Every Man's Fantasy, is this movie that was made unabashedly to cash in on the suicide of an adult film actress named Shauna Grant. And the legend around the film is that she sort of hoodwinked a lot of people involved into thinking it was a legitimate tribute.
Right. And she's on the record with us and with other folks about this, like I was saying, the cynical kind of greedy nature of it. And it's disappointing, but that does capture the multifaceted nature of Roberta Findlay, that you can have these earlier films that do explore some of these issues in some sort of nuanced and, sophisticated ways. But then that film is the complete opposite of that.
And also, I mean, I do think Roberta has a pretty openly amoral philosophy. She's got a sort of Hobbesian worldview, right? That life is struggle, life is exploitation, and that makes sense to her. And that does link these works, right? I mean, you can, her films about women suffering in the 70s. I mean, I think part of what's interesting about them is they're not necessarily empathetic films. I don't think they're particularly sadistic either. They're sort of clinical. I mean, it's sort of presenting to you as, here is woman's condition in a patriarchal society. It is suffering. And, there's not a whole lot of moral judgment offered along with that. So I think by her own account, her life lessons were that the world is an exploitative and combative and abusive place, and cynicism and amorality are the rational reactions to that. And I think that kind of goes through her work, which is why it's so complicated, right? Because you can read these as feminist films, you can also read them as misogynist films, and both of those are plausible arguments to make. But I think from her point of view, it's sort of like she's Harry Lyman, the third man, up on the top of the Ferris wheel looking down at these little ants, and she doesn't care which ones get crushed and which ones don't, right? I mean, that's her bleak worldview.
That's the same worldview she has about her own life and her own professional experiences, too. If you trace through her recollections of her working career as a cinematographer in particular, she doesn't present herself any differently than that. She's very, cold, even on reflecting on her own experiences. you might say cold, you might just say dispassionate. But like Whit said, that's sort of the perspective she looks through. And that's also how she justifies a lot of her more vociferous anti-feminist stances, like her absolutely no women on the set policy. But as Whit and I discovered in our interview with her, she did occasionally hire women as art directors. Isn't that right, Whit? And she sort of made an exception for that with us and didn't really...
Right.
That dispassionate perspective, though, is really how she talks about all these things, including herself.
It's interesting listening to the Rialto Report interview with her again. You know, she obviously has her defenses up a lot. She'll disparage her own work and the world that she was working in. But then at the very end, he sort of thaws her out to the extent that she can sort of say, well, you know, some of the horror films are okay. And, some of the sex films are kind of well shot too, I have to admit.
I think, yeah, it's exactly that. Craftsmanship is the one thing she takes pride in, because when we interviewed her for the book, we were asking about Anyone But My Husband because of that striking opening scene, right? With spackling a chicken or whatever. It's kind of this grotesque raw meat preparation intercut with a graphic sex scene. And I think I was asking these kind of thematic questions. I was like, well, is that a feminist commentary? And she's so dismissive. She's like, why would you even ask me that? What a stupid question. And then Peter was like, I love match cutting. It reminds me of like Lawrence of Arabia, I think he said. And she lit up. She loved that. And she was like, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's it. She thinks these films are garbage. She hates to talk about them analytically, but she gets excited about the lighting. There was that candlelit lesbian scene in Honey Throat, I think it was. And that's the stuff where, yeah, she absolutely will cop to having some pride in her work, which is fascinating. It's great because she was an incredibly skilled craftsman and is.
When we were talking to her, I just kept getting the sense over and over again that there's possibly these defense mechanisms of trying to forestall criticism of her before, if she disengages from it and says it's all junk, which she does, then you can't criticize it because I'm already telling you it's junk. Personally, I just don't believe that. I don't think her work is junk. I think there's all kinds of creative stuff happening throughout it, obviously. But I think that's a mechanism that she uses, because then a few minutes later, she'll talk all about how she, her influences are like John Ford, and her dream project is, help me out here. Wasn't it like Melville or Trollope?
Yeah. Pierre or the ambiguities. Yeah.
Right. Like, something by Trollope, but not this one thing by Trollope. And then, of course, comparing adult film to opera. She's thinking about it in those terms. She is. It's plain as day.
What are your favorites of her career beyond the Flesh trilogy?
I mean, I'm personally a sucker for those sort of grim, moody late 70s hardcore movies like Mystique and A Woman's Torment. I mean, what can I say? I'm just an existential kid at heart, I guess. But they hit pretty hard. I mean, I think they're really effective films. I mean, they're based around classical music. They deliver the generic goods, but they genuinely leave you feeling bad, in a way that is clearly intended and resonates with, some other late 70s hardcore like Roger Watkins, who wrote Mystique. But I think they're really effective films. I mean, they're just rich, gloomy, despondent movies. She uses, sort of off-season resort communities so well, and autumnal sadness hovering over the shore. That whole batch from about 1977 to 79 is a highlight for me.
I mean, this is no surprise. Whit and I have for many years shared a love of that kind of cinema in general. So that's the stuff for me too. I love the whole run of films she made with this rented beach house. I just love going. It's like I'm going back to the beach house too. I'm going back to Fire Island to the beach house too. I love those films. I love Mascara. That's one I can't get enough of. But another one I like that's not in that run is Tenement. There's something about that film. There's a tone that is so brutal. It's just like, I don't know how to describe what it is, but there's something brutal about how it's shot and presented to the audience. And it's a real outlier. I think in the book, we talk about how there's these different phases of her career, and we try to neatly put all the films into these buckets. That one has always stood out. And there's another great essay in the book, too, by our friend Neil Jackson. Just a great essay about that film and its history. And I like that one, too, for the tonal shift.
It links with a whole different body of work, right? That The Exterminator, Combat Shock, the kind of like gritty NYC, especially like outer borough New York 80s grindhouse splatter action movies, but it does it so well. I agree.
I love Tenement also, and I agree that it's an outlier from that 80s run of horror movies because it just feels sweatier, it feels bloodier, feels sleazier, even compared to something like Death Wish 3 that it obviously has a lot of similarities to. It's just more pungent and atmospheric than that film. And there's one moment in Tenement that I always remember where, you know, as the gang is taking over the tenement building and it's just this orgy of violence, there's just this throwaway shot of one of them offhandedly picking up a framed picture of Martin Luther King and just punching it, like punching through the glass and putting it down. And I thought, God, what a gratuitous, awful thing to put in a movie. It takes vision to do that.
Yeah, you're so right. It's pungent. It's aggressive. I rewatched a few days ago Basket Case, which is a movie I just love, you know, I mean, that era and locations and everything. But that movie's aggressive too, but it's a little bit funnier. If you really want to see aggressive, I think Whit is right. Like that little sub run of like The Exterminator and that stuff. Or of course Maniac. That would be the ultimate.
You know, just recently her long unseen last film, Banned, just got released. I'm sure you've watched it. What did you make of that one?
Well, for me, that's like her trauma movie. You keep waiting for like a Lloyd Kaufman cameo. Yeah, I know it's hokey as hell. I will say, I just had the geographic advantage when we interviewed Roberta. You know, Peter was zooming in, but I went into Sear Sound to sit there in person with her. And the thing I'll always remember is we talked for quite a long time, and I took a bathroom break, and so I went to pee in the studio's bathroom, and as I'm standing there, I realized it's the toilet from the film where the evil spirit comes up. And then it was just such a delightful moment. I'm just like, oh boy, I hope it was fiction. But yeah, it's a pretty crappy film, but I think enjoyable in that schlocky class of Nukem High kind of way.
Honestly, that anecdote that Whit just told is probably my favorite story from the making of this book. Like Whit got to go into the bathroom. But, you know, I'm so glad the film is out now officially so people can see it, because at the time, you know, we had to get a little bit creative and dig around and talk to some various different people because we really wanted to see it and know what we were dealing with. I love the film too for its, you know, the trauma kind of feel to it. But she of course, my memory in our interview, she didn't have much to say about it, which is too bad because I think it actually is yet another example of how she could move around from genre to genre. Although that one has some sort of slapsticky, you know, element that do show up in the earlier comedies, you know, the banana jokes from the earlier porn films come to mind.
Yeah, I think it was John from Media Blasters was really generous. Because the film wasn't out yet, and we were like, we're doing a book on Roberta Findlay. We've got to see all of her existing work, and he very generously shared it with us in advance of release, which is how we were able to watch it. But yeah, then just fascinating watching it because you see also how she just used her conditions to create these films, because the scene late in the movie out on the sidewalk, I mean, it's right outside of Sear Sound. Like, again, as I was walking into the studio, I'm like, oh, this is exactly where she shot this. She just walked out the front door. I don't know if she had permits or not. I doubt it because, I mean, it was literally out the front door of the studio.
One of the reasons she disavows that film and some others too is she'll say, those were just, our accountant said we should do it, you know, as a tax situation. That's not that unusual. Lots of films have been made for that reason. In fact, whole industries of filmmaking. There was a whole era of Canadian exploitation films that exist for that reason. And we don't just dismiss them. That's just one economic reason among many, as if, you know, Warner Brothers isn't making films to this day for tax reasons. It's called filmmaking, right? So to me, that is not a reason to dismiss it at all. That's just the reason it was made.
What was Sear Sound like to visit, by the way?
I mean, it was pretty cool. You know, it's funny. Like, obviously, in writing this book, we're trying to be serious, rigorous scholars, right? I mean, that is important. We're not just fanboying out here. You know, I feel pretty good about the way that we and the contributors held that line. You know, it's clearly a group of people who like and admire her work, but that's not the point. You know, the point is to do some actual analysis. That being said, I mean, yeah, it was hard to keep up kind of my my analytical guard upon walking in. You go up an elevator, you know, you walk in off, I think it's 48th Street in Midtown Manhattan. You know, you go up, I can't remember which floor it is, but a short elevator ride. And then there you are, you know, they open this door and there's a bunch of posters for Sonic Youth's Sister was recorded there. And they've got the original poster for it just right in your face. So, I mean, it was definitely a geeking out moment for me. I mean, it was like, holy shit, I'm here in Sears Studio. And you recognize, so many of her movies were shot there. I can't remember which of those early 80s movies had the bands playing and recording in a studio, but that's the studio. I mean, she was just shooting on site. And then she's just got, boxes of old files that, I'd love to see wind up in an archive of the business records from her films and from the studio. So yeah, it was pretty cool. But then, there's Roberta, who's like not interested in any of that. As I'm geeking out, she's like, what do you care about this crap for? This isn't interesting. So that does kind of bring you back to earth. But yeah, no, it was pretty great. I think for the book launch that we're doing this week, I'm going to go in again, partly because she's very tech averse and absolutely refuses to use the internet or computers. And so I'm going to bring my laptop in to set up the Zoom call.
A friend of mine was telling me a little while ago that a filmmaker friend of his was calling this sound studio to do some ADR on his movie, and a woman named Roberta answered the phone. And at that moment, I was just like, no, oh, wait, I'm going to have a heart attack. I know exactly who you're talking about. But at what point in the process did you reach out to Roberta Findlay?
It was pretty late, right? I mean, I think we were probably a little intimidated. I mean, she's got quite a reputation for blowing off people who want to interview her and either refusing or just berating people. So yeah, I think we originally had someone doing an interview chapter, and that didn't work out. So I think we kind of had to just step in last second. So it was pretty late in the game, actually.
Yeah, that's my memory of it too. And this particular part of the story was during the pandemic, I think at a pretty high point of the pandemic. And so I was just in my house in Oregon. I don't think it felt too much like an option to me at the time to come out there and do it with you, Whit. So now I would definitely do that now. I would come out there and we would gear up together. But I remember that morning you were like texting me, like, I think you were like walking past an address of an old adult theater we both knew or something. And we were like so nervous, like, oh my God, are we doing this? It was great. I have a great memory of that.
Yeah, no, because there's 8th Avenue in Manhattan. There's so little left of like the old classic Times Square, but there was like one adult DVD shop on the way. I walked in from Penn Station. I come in from Newark, New Jersey. It's just a 20-minute ride, but then you've got to walk. And I think I deliberately walked kind of the long way to go around the Port Authority just for vibes, for that kind of 80s New York vibe, since the Port Authority is one of the last places that still feels like the 80s, I think, in Midtown Manhattan at least. But yeah, then there were like the one porn shop like right around the corner, and it just felt perfect. It was like, all right, we're in the right place at the right time.
About 10 years ago, I dropped by, what was left of Show World, just to look at it, and not too much to report, but I guess I can always claim that I saw it. So did she like the book?
I don't know, Peter, you want to speak to this or you want me to?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, look, first of all, we should just say up front, Roberta's default position on any criticism, and I use the word criticism broadly here, of her or her career or her work is generally dismissive or just disbelief, however you want to describe it. So we didn't have any illusions that she was suddenly going to be like, oh boy, you two are like my two sons now, and I just love you. So that's not who Roberta is. So we knew that. I think we probably took a little bit of perverse film geek pleasure, in fact, in her dismissing the book, which she did in an interview. And she used some pretty good, I mean, if Roberta is going to dismiss you, you want her to do it in a Roberta way, and she did. Whit, do you remember the exact quote?
I don't remember the exact quote, but yeah, her official party line is essentially, why would anybody write this? It's a total piece of crap, and also I haven't read a word of it, and I never will.
Right,
and yet she's coming to your launch, though. So
well, yeah, of course. Like that's because I think that's partly because she also likes, she likes the who wouldn't like the attention? You want,
yeah. She did say while we were interviewing her, she was like, "This is like therapy for me." She's like, "Your scholarly project is worthless, but here, give me a chance to talk."
Before we wrap up, are there any other essays in the book that you want to call attention to?
Oh man, I mean, I like all of them, to be completely honest. I mean, I feel like we really tapped into a great cohort of sort of scholars who take seriously, adult cinema, exploitation film, and horror movies. if I were just going to shout one out, and again, this is a kind of Sophie's choice because I love all of them, but Kevin Pazelka's piece on what he calls stolar sexuality in Roberta Findlay is this kind of wildly theoretical piece. It's a little bit insane and in a good way. It's like he's just using French theory and French literature. I don't even know exactly what he's doing all of the time. I'm not sure he does, but in like a really genuinely like inspired way. He's really riffing, and he's somebody who really clearly has thought about this deeply and finds if you want to get all pedantic about it, what he finds is an evacuation of Lacanian subjecthood or something to that effect in Roberta's films, which of course she would hate to hear. But it's just a fun piece. It's just alive. It's intellectually alive in a way that you want to read it and then go back to reread sentences along the way because you can't actually parse them, but on a third reading they kind of begin to cohere and click. I love it. It's a challenging but fun piece. So I salute Kevin for being very adventurous in his approach.
Yeah, and Kevin, we're both longtime friends with Kevin. When I started graduate school 20 years ago, Kevin was a little bit ahead of me, and I can recall going to a party. I was a rookie graduate student. I went to this party, and Kevin's holding court in the corner, and he's like, "Okay, let's all name our top 10 movie lists." And I was like, oh, thank God, this is great. Like I'm finally in film graduate school. And then Kevin proceeds to name 10 films I've never heard of. And I slowly backed out of the room. And I was like, I don't know if I belong here. But I've since learned that is what Kevin does. And he brilliantly. Let me shout out a quick piece too from the book, which is I'm so happy that we got it in the book. It's Alexandra Heller Nicholas's chapter. It's about band, which we talked about earlier, but I'm so happy she's in this book because she really published the first serious critical essay on Roberta Findlay. And I have such deep respect for Alexandra and the work that she does as an independent scholar. And her and Kaylaw's chapter, I just love having them in this book. Whit and I are so committed to this study of this kind of work inside and outside the academy from all kinds of people. We love film and we love studying it, and we know these folks do too.
Thanks so much again for making the time.
Thank you, Will. We appreciate that, and we appreciate you buying the book. And
I hope the $100 went to you two and not to some.
Well, it's a nonprofit university press, so I don't mind them.
I loved the book, honestly. I felt like it was written for me. So thank you for
that's awesome.
Thank you for putting it together.
Telephone.